Okay.
All right, so this is our first snippet for this week. We're looking at the Nixon years. So Nixon is elected 1968. It's a he's an interesting administration in terms of his structure. His national security advisor, see here on the screen, is Henry Kissinger. Kissinger largely operates outside of the power of the State Department. So it's this there's a public diplomacy done by the State Department. The Secretary of State is a guy named William Rogers, but the real State Department is done. Foreign policy is done behind the scenes covertly by Kissinger and by Nixon. And Nixon, who was a hardline anti-communist in the 1950s when we first encountered him in this course, when he was first elected to the Senate. But in the 60s, when he's out of office, he refashions himself. He publishes this book called Six Crises. He envisions himself as someone who is committed to a kind of realpolitik vision of international affairs. He's convinced of a few things. First, that the tensions between the Soviet Union and China mean that the United States might be able to exploit one side against the other. Second, that there has to be a way to draw down the war in Vietnam, but not in a way that leads to a sudden dramatic defeat that would harm both American credibility, or what he thinks is American credibility, and his own personal standing. And third, a real contempt for the establishment, the media, the foreign policy elite. He and Trump are very different kind of figures, but the same kind of disdain that Trump felt for the media, Nixon also had. He's facing a pretty divided public opinion. So this is a poll from just after he takes office. You can see that the American public is sort of divided into four factions in terms of what to do about Vietnam. Some want to really go all out. Others just want to pull out. Others are sort of more ambivalent. It is interesting that by January of 1969, a majority of Americans believe that the U.S. made a mistake in sending troops to Vietnam, and that number will just skyrocket in the late 1970s. And so the Nixon approach here is, maybe we can. There's not the public pressure on Nixon. He can't be blamed for the war, but at the same time, he is convinced, and I'm not sure that he's correct in this regard, but he's convinced that an immediate withdrawal would harm his broader foreign policy project, which is to reorient the relationship with the Soviets and the Chinese. So eventually what he does is this program called Vietnamization. You can see the chart here. So there's a gradual drawdown of U.S. Troops in Vietnam, but still by 1971, there are 150,000 U.S. troops. Critically, there's also a diminution in U.S. deaths. And so the public pressure through anti-war protests begins to drop from 70, especially into 71. And Vietnamization as a scheme, that means basically transferring responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese government, largely by giving the South Vietnamese massive amounts of U.S. military assistance. By the mid-70s, South Vietnam, in this country that didn't exist 2 decades before, has the world's 4th largest air force. And it's a nominal air force. These are all planes that the U.S. had supplied. But again, Nixon's goal here is that he doesn't want to be seen as overseeing a precipitous withdrawal. He, as Johnson before him, was concerned about North Vietnamese penetration through Laos and Cambodia. And so in 1970, he authorizes a covert, it doesn't stay covert for long, U.S. military operation into Cambodia. The U.S. never declares war on Cambodia. One effect of this is to destabilize Cambodian politics. And this also which will eventually lead to the coming to power of this genocidal communist regime called the Khmer Rouge. And it also triggers a constitutional crisis. And members of Congress are saying, look, we did not authorize an invasion of Cambodia. Where does the president under the Constitution have authority to do this? And the result is a measure called the Cooper-Church Amendment, which seeks to use the appropriations power to deny funds for the intervention in Cambodia. And this looks as if it might pass. Eventually, Nixon does a deal with Congress. So this is an early sign of Congress becoming more powerful, which is one of the themes of the early 70s. where Nixon, says, he pushes allies in Congress to say, all right, we'll accept the Cooper Church Amendment as long as it mandates a withdrawal by June the 30th of 1970. It turns out that Nixon had planned to withdraw by that point as well. So this is one aspect of the Nixon policy towards Southeast Asia, which is to do a sort of short-term expansion with the hopes of paving the way for withdrawal. And here's Nixon with the Reverend Billy Graham, a prominent evangelical leader, with Nixon kind of trying to blame Kennedy and Johnson for his problems.
Of course, we're fighting a very tough battle here. Everybody wants to pull out, but I have to fight against the tide. I got to do the right thing.
And I've got an editorial in the New York Times on Friday, which I wrote this morning. They had it
for you
yesterday.
Good.
And I'm putting all the blame of this whole thing on Kennedy.
That's right. He started the damn thing. He killed DM, and he sent the first 16,000 combat people there himself.
Well, I'm saying that the first time I ever heard of our involvement was 4 days before he was inaugurated, playing golf with him. He said, I quote, "We cannot allow Laos and South Vietnam to fall to the communists." And then I said when President Johnson took over, we had 16,000 troops there.
That's right.
And I said the political climate in the United States...
Well, and DM had been murdered. You see, Billy, the key thing here was Kennedy's, and I must say our friend Lodge's agreement to murder DM. DM, that's what killed that's opened the whole thing.
If you remember last week, we heard the snippet of LBJ also basically blaming Kennedy for the assassination of ZM. These are extraordinary. These are our private conversations. There's no hint at all of this in terms of the public explanation for U.S. policy. But both Johnson and Nixon are convinced that Kennedy authorized the assassination of ZM, this one-time U.S. ally. The record here does seem to be much more complex, although as Nixon points out, Henry Cabot Lodge's involvement in the sort of run up to the assassination, I think, was probably more less deniable in that approach. But this is a good example of this credibility gap phenomenon that I had mentioned earlier, that the government is saying one thing publicly, even though privately it believes something else entirely. All that said, as Nixon is drawing down the U.S. commitment to Vietnam, he does reach out to both the Soviets and, more interestingly, to the Chinese. Here he is with Leonid Brezhnev. The phenomenon that he pushes with the Soviets comes to be called détente, the idea of the U.S. and the Soviets basically acting as great powers. The assumption here is the United States is not going to challenge Soviet predominance in Eastern Europe. Eventually, there'll be a treaty signed in Helsinki, Finland, after Nixon has left office, in which the U.S. recognizes the post-World War II Soviet control over the boundaries and de facto Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Brezhnev, meanwhile, remember, he's the guy he had taken over from Khrushchev. There's a brief power scramble. He consolidates control. He's a hardline communist. He's Khrushchev was in some ways interesting and unpredictable. Brezhnev is not, but he sees the data, which is not clear to the U.S., that the Soviet economy is gradually weakening, and so. From his standpoint, arms control is also desirable because it might be a way to reduce Soviet military spending and repurpose some of that money for economic affairs. And so ultimately, the two sides will negotiate a treaty called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The acronym is SALT, S-A-L-T. Which is the first of two of these such treaties. This one will be approved by the Senate. The second one, which is negotiated under Jimmy Carter, will not. There is, however, another reason why Brezhnev is quite open to the idea of negotiations with Nixon, and that is that simultaneously, Nixon, this guy who was a hardline, anti-communist, pro-nationalist China figure in the 1950s, has opened a secret channel to the government of Mao Zedong in China in the late 60s, early 70s, and there had been a border war between China and the Soviet Union in 68, 69. The two sides had not gotten the relationship had become toxic between the two sides. And first Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor, and ultimately Nixon himself, this is in 1972 with his wife Pat Nixon, traveled to China and enter into a normalization agreement between the United States and the People's Republic of China, which includes some public arrangements. The U.S. is now okay with the PRC taking China's seat at the UN that had been held by nationalist China, Taiwan, in the 50s and 60s. The U.S. agrees to set into motion a formal diplomatic recognition of the PRC as the actual government of China, so it withdraws recognition of Taiwan. That process finishes in the late 70s, but the first de facto U.S. ambassador to China is George H.W. Bush, the future president, who's appointed by Nixon, at this point a former congressman and chairman of the Republican National Committee. Later will be head of the CIA. And to the Chinese, the argument that Nixon makes is, look, we can do deals in terms of strategic balance. We can maybe have economic arrangements between the two sides. We can help you vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so what Nixon understands is that in this unusual triangular relationship, both the Soviet Union and China have some incentive to have cooperative relations with the U.S. And by the end of Nixon's first term in 1972, he sort of remapped the great power relationship to create more stable and relatively more peaceful relations between the United States and both the Soviet Union and China. Not for any idealistic reasons. Nixon doesn't care about these things, but for reasons of great power politics. Nonetheless, as he's doing this, he's agreeing to, he's committed in his own mind that he's going to have to eventually pull out of Vietnam. But as the North Vietnamese are pushing for an immediate U.S. withdrawal and presumably North Vietnamese takeover of South Vietnam, Nixon is unwilling to do this. He doesn't want the PR hit from this. And so in Christmas of 1972, he authorizes a major escalation of the U.S. bombing campaign against North Vietnam, calculating correctly, as it turns out, that both the Soviets and the Chinese aren't really going to want to come to the aid of their North Vietnamese allies if that means scuttling these broader strategic partnerships, newfound strategic partnerships with the U.S. And here he is in a conversation with Kissinger, and Kissinger, as always, is kind of sucking up to him. But you get a sense of how both of them are looking at this arrangement whereby the United States is going to escalate the war in Vietnam as the first step to an ultimate drawdown. This conversation is from 1972.
So this is another spectacular for you, Mr.
Yeah, well, hell, we don't know whether it's that.
Terrific courage to do it.
Well, at least it pricked the boil, didn't it?
Mr. President, anything else would have been worse in the long run. And all the guys who are now saying, well, why do we do it with B-52s? All the people who are saying if you did it with DC-3s, they'd be objective.
The point is that, as we know, we couldn't do it with anything for B-52s because, goddammit, there's nothing else that can fly at this time of year.
Mr. President, within 10 days, you got these guys to the table, which no other method could have done.
Let's just keep right on.
And I think this way it makes the weekend papers, and the excitement is going to die.
Well, it'll make the news magazines, too.
Yeah.
They'll open up to this, don't worry.
Mac Bundy called me last night. He said he's going to write a public letter to you.
Protesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course.
I said, why? He said, because what am I going to tell my son? I said, I'll tell you what you can tell your son. Tell them I got us into this war, and now I'm preventing us from getting out, and hung up on it. But that New York establishment hasn't...
They're done.
Hasn't ever come...
Well, the main thing now, Henry, is that we have to pull this off.
I mean, I like this conversation because it gives a sense of both Kissinger and Nixon's mentality, but Nixon constantly looking at this kind of calculating effort. And ultimately, there are negotiations at Paris, and Kissinger is asserting here that peace is at hand. This is a convenient assertion as well. In 1972, the Democrats nominate an anti-war nominee, a South Dakota senator named George McGovern, who had been one of the first members of the Senate to oppose the war in Vietnam. And by pushing forward to peace, to the idea of a possible peace deal before the election, Nixon basically undercuts the central rationale for the McGovern candidacy. And in 1972, there will be only one other election like this, which will be Ronald Reagan's reelection in 1984. Nixon sweeps the entire country. McGovern doesn't even get 40% of the vote, and McGovern, who is probably the most left-wing presidential nominee until arguably Biden in 2020. I mean, the country has moved a lot to the left in the last 50 years. He's sort of crushed in the contest. The U.S. will formally pull out of Vietnam in 1973 after the signing of a formal peace deal in which there's a secret codicil in which the North Vietnamese agree not to really push for a total invasion of South Vietnam for 18 months, to give what's sometimes referred to as a decent interval for the United States to claim, we did everything we could. The South Vietnamese just couldn't handle it. So you can see here the total U.S. Deaths in Vietnam, more than 58,000, for a war that was never declared, and for which the U.S. purpose of fighting was never entirely clear. This is the most famous of the photos for the ultimate U.S. Withdrawal. This is when the North Vietnamese do sweep into South Vietnam in 1975. By this point, Nixon is out of office, and this is a photograph of the residence of a security attaché. These desperate Vietnamese who had assisted the United States in the conflict, trying to get on what will turn out to be the last flight into the U.S. Embassy compound and ultimately out of South Vietnam. And you have this U.S. military official preventing them from doing so because there's no room left in the helicopter. And ultimately, many of these people will be captured and imprisoned by the new communist government of a unified Vietnam. So there's the humiliation of the U.S. being driven out of the war in 1975, but also the moral betrayal of Vietnamese who had assisted the U.S. during the conflict. But from Nixon's standpoint, his goal was not to get the blame, and ultimately he does not. So that's it for our first snippet for this.